Welcome back to The Bandit of Ashley Downs by Dave and Netta Jackson. Chapter 12, Treasure's End. Curly arrived in London late on the day before Christmas. It had taken him almost a week, by farmer's wagon and public stagecoach, walking on mild days to help save his money. Now a light snow was falling that brightened the otherwise dingy city and made the afternoon cheerful. Curly walked past St. George's Church, just for old time's sake. Some people were standing on the steps singing Christmas carols. Someone was playing a trumpet, another a horn, and two more were keeping time with tambourines. He stopped with other passers-by and joined in as the carolers encouraged the listeners to sing along with "We Wish You a Merry Christmas." Then he hurried along to the warehouse. As he approached, a light shone from inside, and he noticed the large front door was open, and a wagon was sitting in the entrance. Two men were unloading large sacks of something, maybe flour, Curly guessed, and stacking it in the warehouse. Curly walked past on the other side of the street, so as not to attract any attention. He continued until he was nearly a block away and could just see the front of the warehouse. There, he waited until the driver pulled his horse and wagon out of the entrance and drove back down the street. Within a few minutes, someone came out of the warehouse and closed the front door. But it was getting so dark, Curly could not see if the man shut himself in the building or locked the door from the outside and left. Curly retraced his steps, trying to see if light showed through the two small windows high in the front wall of the warehouse. No light was visible, but that didn't guarantee anything. The man could have carried the light to the back part of the building, where it couldn't be seen from the street. Cautiously, the boy moved closer and finally crossed the street, studying the windows and the crack around the door for any signs of light. At any moment, he was ready to pretend to be casually walking by, or run if necessary, should someone open the door. How stupid of me, Curly thought. All I have to do is look for tracks in the snow. That will show me if the man went back through the door or walked away. Sure enough, there in the snow, almost blue in the fading light of the late afternoon, was a set of footprints leading up the street in the same direction the wagon had gone. Curly's heart beat faster. He was so close to the treasure. He looked both ways to make sure no one saw him. Then he ducked down the narrow passage between the warehouse and the building next door. He had come this way so often when he was living with Spuds that he knew each step. The place where the rainwater had washed a ditch in the ground, the steel trap door to the warehouse's unused coal bin, the stack of old lumber partially blocking the passage, even the step up at the far end. Curly peeked around the corner. Everything looked the same. The familiar rain barrel, the rubbish heap, and no one was around. He hadn't expected anyone. The back entrance to the building was seldom used except by Spuds and himself, and the other buildings in the neighborhood, with doors opening onto the narrow alley, had no watchman staying inside. Curly proceeded, noting with relief that there were no tracks in the thin layer of snow. Apparently, no new watchman had taken Spuds's place, at least not one who used the back door. Suddenly, the passageway seemed to explode right beside Curly. There was a loud screech, and several cans came tumbling down off the rubbish heap. Curly jumped back, ready to run for safety, and then he saw it was only a cat escaping down the alley. He stood there, his legs so weak that he almost sank to the ground. Maybe I should come back tomorrow in the daylight, he thought, shaking. It'll be Christmas, and no one will be around. But then there was the question of where he was going to spend the night. He was almost out of money, and after the long trip from Bristol, he was very tired and didn't want to have to find a dustbin to sleep in. Besides, it was getting colder. As he proceeded toward the back door, he considered spending the night in the warehouse. But that was too risky. It was one thing to get caught sleeping where you shouldn't. Someone might yell at you or hit you as he chased you off, but if he were caught in the warehouse with all that money, he would go to prison. The police would know immediately where it came from. He needed the money he needed to get the money and get away from the warehouse for good. He tried the door, but it was locked. Well, that wasn't unusual. It was supposed to be locked. He moved a few feet away and lifted the rock where Spuds always kept the key. A wave of reassurance flooded over Curly when his fingers found it in the cold earth. It was rusty and dirty, but it was there. However, when he tried it in the lock, it wouldn't even go in, let alone turn. In a panic, Curly tried jamming the key at the hole again and again. It was no use. Finally, he calmed himself and looked more closely. Someone had changed the lock. No wonder the old key wouldn't fit. He had to think. There must be another way into the building. He studied the lock in the failing light. Maybe he could break in. But that didn't look hopeful. He thought about trying to force the front door or climb through one of the front windows. But that was too risky. Anyone coming down the street might see him. There had to be another way. Curly thought his way around the building, imagining it from every angle. I might be able to get up on the roof, but what good would that do? There's no way in from there. And then he remembered the steel trap door to the coal bin. He had no idea why the warehouse had a coal bin. There was no furnace, and the little stove Spuds used didn't take that much coal. But still, it was there. Maybe the building had been something else at one time and needed a furnace. He ran back around the building and up the narrow passage to where the steel trapdoor was set into the side of the warehouse wall. There was no lock on it, just a piece of old wire twisted to hold the door closed. Curly undid the wire and pulled on the door, but it had been closed for so many years that the hinges had rusted tight. He braced his legs and pulled harder. Still, it wouldn't budge. Finally, he gave up and went looking for something to pry the door open. In a few minutes, he found a stick and returned to use it as a lever. With a creaking groan, the door slowly swung open. Inside, there was only blackness. Curly could not see anything. He poked the stick through the opening and felt around on the floor inside. Then, using the stick to steady himself, he climbed through the hatch. There, except for the square of dim light behind him, he was in total blackness. He took a step forward and ran into something. He felt with his hands and discovered a wall of barrels higher than he could reach and extending in both directions. There was only a narrow passage between the barrels and the outside wall of the warehouse. The boy crept along in one direction, knowing that at some point the stack of barrels must end. It did, but his way was blocked with wooden crates that were stacked tight against the wall, preventing him from going any farther. He retraced his steps and tried going in the other direction, but the passage grew narrower until he couldn't squeeze himself through any farther. In this direction, the barrels were stacked closer and closer to the wall. A terrible vision of him getting stuck passed through Curly's mind. They might never find me back here, he thought. He went back the other way until he came to the crates. There, with much difficulty, he found handholds that enabled him to climb. Higher and higher he struggled until he came to the roof of the warehouse. Between the top of the boxes and the roof, there was enough space to crawl over the boxes. It was easier climbing down the other side, since the boxes weren't stacked straight, but like stair steps, and soon he reached the open area of the warehouse. He worked his way across the floor like a blind man, hands out in front of him, taking little shuffling steps so as not to trip and fall over something. In this manner, he proceeded in the direction where he remembered Spud's small living quarters had been. All the while, he worried whether he could find his way back out. Could he find the right pile of crates to climb up, over, and out? Suddenly, he was struck a terrible blow right in the face. He staggered back as lights flashed in his head. He waved his arms in front of him and found that he had crashed into a post that supported the roof of the building. Somehow, with both arms out, he had held them wide enough for them to go on either side of the post as he walked smack into it. He was recovering from the shock when he realized where he was. This was the post that stood at the edge of Spud's living space. A few steps to the right should be the old stove, and beyond it, near the wall, should be Spud's bed. Curly sidestepped, waving his arms in the dark until his hand clanged into the stovepipe. It made a terrible but comforting racket, and it was still warm. It felt good on the boy's hands. He worked his way around the stove and proceeded through the gloom toward the bed. One more step and I ought to be there, he thought. He took another step and another, but there was no bed, and he finally bumped into the wall. The bed was gone. Fear seized him. If they've removed the bed, maybe they cleaned out this whole area and found the loose stone in the wall. Maybe they got the money. In a panic, Curly began feeling the stones in the wall. Back and forth his hands worked, dislodging bits of old mortar and sand from between the stones. Curly could smell the dust of the place that he was stirring up, but he could not find the loose stone. Then, with relief, he was sure he had found it. It was in the right place, and his fingertips could not feel any mortar around it. He pulled on the stone as he had seen Spud's do, but it would not move. He pulled harder until his fingernails tore, but without any luck. Should he go back and get the stick he'd used to pry open the coal bin door? Maybe he could use it to work the stone loose. Other worries filled his mind. Maybe I've got the wrong stone. Maybe they found the money and sealed this stone back in place and I can't feel the new mortar. Finally, he gave up. It was hopeless. Going back for the stick and returning felt impossible. He began to panic. He wanted out of the warehouse more than he wanted the money. He had to get out before he was caught. How long have I been in here? He wondered. Maybe it's Christmas morning already. He began to head toward the other side of the warehouse, hoping he could find the right stack of crates to climb over when his shins crashed into a low table, tipping it over and sending him tumbling to the floor. It was all Curly could do not to jump up and start running, but his mind told him that would be crazy. Sit still and calm down, he told himself in a whisper. No one is in here. No one knows you're in here. He forced himself to stay seated on the floor and count to 10. As he did so, his hand came across something long and round and smooth, but not cold or heavy like a pipe. It's a candle, realized Curly. He patted around further on the floor. His hands hit a tin cup a spoon, and a few other items that must have been on the table. And then they came upon a small paper box. It held matches, and they rattled when Curly shook them. He pulled one out and struck it on the floor. The flare of the flame almost blinded him, and it took a minute before his eyes adjusted and he could light the candle. Then he stood up and looked around. Apparently, someone had been staying there. The person had moved Spud's bed. There was a crate with some food in it and some old clothes, but those things didn't interest Curly. He turned toward the wall and saw that he'd been working on the right stone, at least the one behind which he remembered Spud's hiding his things. But if it was the right stone, why wouldn't it budge? When he examined it more closely, however, his heart leaped. The reason the stone wouldn't move was that a wooden peg had been wedged into its right edge. The peg held the stone firmly. Curly went back to the upended table and retrieved the spoon. He worked its handle behind the peg and soon popped it out. He put the candle down, paying no attention that it was on its side, and the wax was melting while the flame got bigger. He pulled on the stone, and this time it moved. It was heavier than he had imagined, and he had to brace himself as it slid out. He put it down and grabbed the candle and looked into the opening. There was a leather bag that looked like the one that had been in the money case. Curly pulled it out slowly, almost reverently. Would the money be there? He was shaking with excitement as he opened the bag and reached in. His fingers closed around first one, then another and another stack of paper pound notes. The money was still there.